Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everybody. Welcome to the Shout Out Show, the SOS. I'm your host, Preacher Moss. As always, I'd like to welcome everybody to come to the show, whether it's your first time or whether it's your 57th time. I just appreciate you dropping in, getting a little information, having a little interchange, if you will, having that fellowship. A fellowship, I like to say, that's definitely needed in the world today with all the things that are going on, whether it be COVID, whether it be social justice issues, whether it be the fight against white supremacy. These things are all on our plates. They're all on our minds and on our spirits. But I feel personally that if we can have a conversation, if you will, if we can have a meaningful dialogue, then a lot of the things that we're talking about begin to make sense. Now, I want to make two housekeeping notes, if you will. One from yesterday. I want to give a shout out to Big Brother, Brother Ziad out of Toledo, Ohio. He called me after the show yesterday about cornerstone racism, and he enlightened me on something. I'll be honest, when he called me, he's my Palestinian Arab brother. I'll be honest, when he called me, I thought maybe he was insulted about something I may have said, but he enlightened me in something that I didn't think, and I want to bring it up on the show. When I talk about the cornerstone racism, you know what I really didn't realize was the oppression that went on with the employees. Some of the employees that were doing the work, if you will, who were in those spaces, for lack of a better word, and the things they had to go through working those spaces. Some of the Arabs are very mean spirited to their own Arab folks. So he brought that point to me. I just want to say, hey, listen, oppression works in a lot of different ways. None of them are good. So that being said, that's number one. Number two is the title of the show is, of course, supposed to be Smiling Behind Bars. I switched it, not so much switched it. I call it Free But Still Incarcerated. I've been doing a little due diligence. Our latest case of what we have defined as police brutality down in Atlanta with Mr. Rayshard Brooks is an interesting piece because for once we're able to actually get a little bit of a deeper delve into the person that we're talking about, Mr. Rayshard Brooks. He created something. He gave an interview. I'm trying to remember the actual medium. Maybe I can give it to you later. He gave an interview which was very, very insightful about being free but still incarcerated. And he talked about doing his time in prison. Brothers and sisters, he talked about doing his time in prison, but coming out and still having to deal with the constraints of being a prisoner. Therefore, we're talking free but still incarcerated. He talked about so many things about the jobs and things. And I didn't know Mr. Brooks. I didn't know. That's just being full honest. I didn't know him. But I will present to you the story of someone who I did know, a Muslim brother, like my big brother. I met him in 1998. His name was Ahmad Bilal. He was the uncle of someone who I sort of like, I was teaching then, so I mentored this man. And he said, my uncle Bilal is a Muslim. He's getting out. Would you mind? And who knew it was going to be a relationship that lasted almost 20 years. But in that 20 years that Bilal got out of prison, he did a bid. I think he did 8.5 or 10. 8.5 of 10. He's doing federal charges. Anybody that knows federal charges, you can do the numbers. You got to do 85% of the bid. But it was interesting to watch him come out and go through that process. It's a very negative, nuanced process of being someone who's done your time. You've done your debt to society, but it doesn't really end. It doesn't really end. And I've basically come to the conclusion that there's some underlying scope between that system, if you will. And I think it ties into what we've seen with George Floyd and Mr. Brooks, because it has a lot to do with how the system treats them. When you're in the system, the law enforcement, the legal system treats you a certain way. people say, what way does it treat? It doesn't give you the fairness. It doesn't give you a particular type of due process. Like due process is removed. So everything that you've done in your life, despite the fact how you may have turned it around, how you may have fixed it, how you may have been a service to your community, your family, on the books, in the legal record, it doesn't matter. So I was thinking about this whole thing about scope and measuring tone, and it really began to bother me. No, let me say it really began to eat at me because for all the things that we're going through right now, nobody's really fully addressing the culture, the negative culture of having a prison industrial complex. And the relationship that we have with the police, African Americans, everybody knows that the relationship that African Americans have with the police is a relationship that freed Africans had with the police, and a relationship that slave Africans have with the police, which was the police were slave patrols. They were meant to protect, mind, regulate, maintain, and modify behavior to remain product. Now, that's a lot of things I just said, but the idea is you're there to protect someone else's interest, not a scenario or situation whereby you signed up for the common good, though I'm sure there are officers who signed up from the common good. The merit, if you will, of public policing has to do with maintaining the interest of capital. So I just finished watching The Last Stand, and I'm going to suggest everybody watch the last 35 minutes of Do the Right Thing. Do the Right Thing is a classic narrative in terms of the exact same thing I'm thinking about, because I was thinking about at the end of the movie where Radio Raheem gets choked out, if you will. It started hitting me in my head. I was like, I wonder if Radio Raheem had a criminal record. If anyone around that shop had a criminal record, if the mayor had a criminal record, if Mookie had a criminal record, because there was an underlying theme that nobody could get off the block. And I would say this about the prison industrial complex. A lot of people don't realize the amount of money that were put into private prisons, the scope that private prisons had to play in terms of turning money over in places that they didn't have it. A lot of these private prisons were, I want to say, funded by places like McDonnell Douglas that were defense contractors, and they figured out a culture within a culture whereby we can deny you rights, number one, we can deny you citizenship, number two, and number three, we can deny you normalcy when you get out of the system. There's a big thing now, and they're not talking about it. If you ever watch the documentary 13 on Netflix, there's a very important thing that there's been a fundamental shift now. Prisons aren't making as much money as they can. Private prisons are losing money going back all the way to 2001, if you will. And they made a fundamental shift to get out of the prison business because there's so much regulation now. And they got into the probation business. And the probation business is huge. We're talking about home monitoring. We're talking about where you go for jobs. We're talking about how the probation people check you in. And it's an interesting process. And I can only speak to it from my experience with Ahmad coming out of prison and having to be released home, but having a very long period, I think 5 to 7 years. It might have been 5 years where technically the term is he was on paper. That's what probation means. He was on paper. And what that means is while you're allowed to work and things like that, it's registered, it's regulated. Okay, when I say regulated, it means that you're not really free. People are telling you free, but you're not really 100% free. You have to check in with people. You have to get clearance to go places. Ahmad worked as the security for Allah Made Me Funny in the early days because I was trying to give him work because he couldn't get the work that he needed. And this was something that persisted his whole life. Even when he got off, he still had the record. When he got off paper, he still had to deal with the record that he was an ex-felon. This is interesting because I find it not being discussed in the African-American community. We talk about prison, we talk about police brutality. We're not talking about the larger scope of probation culture in the African-American and Latino community. When I say probation culture, meaning that they have found a way legally to restrict your social mobility. So if the job is in Dallas and you live in Dallas, but there's good work in Houston, you can't go there without the probation. You can't go there. Or if there's a great job in Seattle, but you live in Tacoma, you can't go there. Or if you're in Maryland, but there's an excellent job in Virginia, you can't go there because you're part and parcel of this probation system. So when I say free but still incarcerated, it brings the idea of, do people really, really, really intend for you to be free? That said, I want to make sure that we stay on topic today. Stay on topic and it's very important because I'm going to bring somebody in tomorrow. I almost forgot. We have our first full-on guest tomorrow, Imam Zaid Shaka, who will be on this channel where we are, and I'm going to get some of his advice, his sage advice, also a spiritual understanding of some of the things that we're going through, where it's not so far romanticized, but he can bring it to you in a very, very relevant and meaningful tone. But this whole thing, brothers and sisters, as I watched Brother Rayshard Brooks speak, he had a clarity that had so much pain in it. It was scary. Let me give my man Earth. I haven't seen you, brother. I hope all is well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Earth. Glad you can make it. But this idea of the probationary culture, and we should all know it. You know, the probationary culture has been something that goes back to slave culture. Everyone knows the 13th Amendment, but the 13th Amendment says that you have freedom. Slavery is abolished as long as you're not a criminal. If you're a criminal, then you have basically lent yourself back to a slave system. Everybody knows this. This is interesting. And once you get out of it, though, we all know that, but there's no constitution to deal with the whole aspect of probation culture. And I find that extremely interesting as we began to look for answers, if you will, demand a certain type of accountability, but we're not actually speaking truth to the problem. So we're going to take a short break here. I have a little advertisement to you, and I will be right back. Okay, everybody? Thank you so much. People often ask me, how do you write comedy? Well, comedy is an art form. It's communication. People often ask me, how do you write comedy? And I reach in my pocket and I say, I do it with this pen, but I'm surgical. People often ask me, Preacher Moss, how do you write comedy? And I tell them, listen, everybody has a talent, but it takes skill to get paid for the talent. It takes discipline to maintain the skill. With that said, when you do all those things, you're not writing comedy. It's writing yourself. And I'm back, everybody. Thank you for that little commercial break. I want to continue on this topic. It's not a popular topic. And because it's not a popular topic, I find that people are not talking about it enough, and we keep seeing the repercussions of it. This system, if you will, this probationary system is diabolical on a good day. It's diabolical in the way that it affects, particularly in large proportion, Black men, Latino men. But more importantly, the secondary nuance of it is that it affects families. The ability to be able to build relationships with your family, which requires certain things. You have to generate revenue. You have to be present. There has to be sustainability. There has to be normalcy. And this whole thing, if you will, of the probation culture does not allow that. Doing some research, even on George Floyd, he went through that process. And the reason he winds up in Minnesota, brothers and sisters, is he said he couldn't find good work in Houston. And I can dig that because Houston has an extremely jacked up criminal justice system, and it just follows you around. I mean, it just follows you around. If you have a record, it follows you around. He wanted a small break. He went to Minnesota. He was doing that girlfriend family, all that type of stuff. But the one thing you can't escape is that if you're in a situation, you get pulled over by a policeman, and the policeman runs your tags or runs your license, they're going to pull up a different story on you. They're going to pull up the worst representation on you of you, and that's what they go on. Could it be that some of the things that we're beginning to see now, brothers and sisters, is that this culture, this very, very pervasive probation culture, has now led to us having a scenario where it's a come to Jesus moment, whereby people don't want to be profiled by the worst example that you can give them. Imagine you went in for a job interview and you had recommendations. You had 3 recommendations. 2 were great, 1 was awful. And the person looked at your 2 great resumes, discarded them, and said, I'm going with the awful resume as a means to disqualify you. So now you're no longer competitive for this job. It doesn't matter your requirements, nothing. It means that I can put you in this box as much as I want to. And I began to feel a little bit for, how you doing, Brother Jabril? And I began to feel for George Howard. I began to feel for Rayshard Brooks, and a lot of other people I began to feel for, because it's a go-to when we have these police-assisted shootings or whatever, that the first thing they do is they go for the person's record. Systematically, we go for the person's record. We want to know the worst thing about that person to justify our behavior. Now, the nuance of this is, if there is some, the nuance of this is, it's a system. It's a paid system. I've told everyone here, and I don't care who disagrees with me, you can agree with me. The behavioral economics of probation culture is insidious, number 1. Number 2, it's nefarious. It is designed for systematic failure once you leave prison. Now imagine, you leave prison, that's systematic failure, but you pay for it. When you come out of prison, it's still designed for systematic failure, though you don't pay for it, but you have to engage it as a way to get through. That's why the recidivism rates are so high. And I found that it's not that the brothers give up. It's that in the space to try and prove myself, after I've done however many years, I'm at another level of having to prove myself with another group of people having to prove myself in a system that's patently failed. Essentially, I have to engage with a system that I know has failed many before me and has full intention to fail me now. So when we begin to look at it, it's interesting because these are the systems now that we feed our children to. Foster care, juvenile care, CYA, all these systems that have been around for a long time, and they're feeder systems. And even when you get out, you're still in a feeder system. Free, but still incarcerated. It's the idea, brothers and sisters, that are we really free? Are there systems in place that are really mandated and established to make sure that we can give the best of ourselves in systems that rates us on the worst? Meaning, if you have a credit report, do you know that on your credit report, you can get denied for the worst thing? The smallest thing, doesn't matter how long you've been paying off your house, and these algorithms look for a thing to discredit you, look for a thing to kill your credit rating. I had a situation with the credit card, American Express. I'm going to call you out. My credit score moved a little bit because I had to do some things in COVID to make sure everything was all right. They absolutely trashed my credit line. And I called them and I said, you don't really understand what you did to my credit line. It's not that you reduced it. It's that you made it to a point where it's so low, it now looks like I'm using more than half, brothers and sisters. I'm using more than half of my credit line. And normally, you're only supposed to be doing less than 30% or less. And it's just those things that allow me to open up and say, if I'm a guy that's been able to go out and have my own business, and I've had plenty of opportunities. I've gone to good schools, but I'm still subject to the same things. What kind of system are we really, really putting out there? How can we call this an equitable understanding of life and mobility if these things are still on the books? I begin to think about it. I watched the tape of Mr. Rayshard Brooks. Now, I'm going to say this, and fine. Mr. Rayshard Brooks was probably intoxicated. Call it what it is. But let me say this. He was intoxicated, but he was calm. He was calm. He answered questions wrong. He thought he was in one city when he's in actual other. It was like a bad episode of Cops, but he was calm. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't trying to go anywhere. All I remember really was at the beginning of the body cam when they had his license, and it was clear to me they had run his license and they had brought up all of his felony charges, and they began to treat him differently. And I believe that willingness to treat him differently is why he's not with us today. So as we began to wind down, I wanted to take just a short amount of time. I don't want to take up your whole day. I don't want to do that. And just a reminder, brothers and sisters, I won't be on the telecast tomorrow. We have Imam Zaid Shaker. The subject is interesting. I want a scholarly opinion on the topic of uh, can you heal stupid? When people do stupid things, can you heal? Can they heal? And it's an interesting topic. It has layers to it. And I know he'll hit those layers because a lot of it is about forgiveness, redemption, and knowing the difference between the two. But even talking about forgiveness and redemption, we're talking about a probation system that is it's not probationary. It's literally set to be permanent. Why is it when you have a criminal record and you do all those things that you still can't vote in some places? Or, it affects your ability to get a house, or it affects your ability to go to school, or it affects your ability to get public assistance. And you start thinking about these things. It's like, how do these guys make it? Well, a lot of them don't make it. A lot of them fight the good fight. A lot of them find comfort, they find resolve in the things that aren't legal, the things that aren't healthy. And I'm not saying all of them. I know a lot of guys have gone through the system, they made good on it, but it does go to say that it does affect you. Just think of the time you got a traffic ticket, just that interchange with the police, and you got a traffic ticket, and just having to be in a place where you couldn't go. Like you had to pull over. You saw the lights and you were automatically trained and you pulled over and you said, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to wait for the policeman. And it's a protocol. You've rehearsed it in your mind. Imagine that's your life every day. After you do some time, it becomes your life every day. I said oftentimes on this telecast that the essence or the reality of being black in America is that your mama knows and your grandma knows that you're not safe. And there's systems in place to make let you know every time that you're not safe. I always think about when I was a kid and had to go to school. There's integration and busing back in the day. And I remember for the first 3 years of elementary school with white teachers, I didn't feel safe. I knew they didn't want me there, and I let them know I didn't want to be there. But I'm just saying, it just came across that way. And even today, I watch my mother, I watch my aunts, I watch my elders, and I love them. But there's a hitch in their giddy up. And a hitch in their giddy up doesn't matter how successful they've been, how blessed they've been. They're always looking over their shoulder because they just never enjoyed the aspect of feeling fully safe. And, they sacrifice and they worried about us being safe as well. But we have these systems in place. So maybe the topic that we're going to talk about maybe next week or another time is like, how do we get from that feeling to safe? Brother Rashard Brooks is not here with us right now. And I don't question things. Laws and control, I don't question those things, but I damn sure question people. And I have to ask, what is the thing inside these people, these individuals, that allow them to come up with such insidious systems? You know what you're doing when you put it in legislation. You know what you're doing when you sign the paperwork with these private prisons. You know what you're doing when you break ground. It has nothing to do with rehabilitation. It has nothing to do with realization or self-actualization. It just has to do with incarceration. Smiling behind bars has to do with the fact that these brothers come out of a situation, a scenario whereby they have to smile. If you've ever done any service work with prisons, I've done comedy shows with prisons, and all I can think about, more so than the jokes, is that my job is so important at that point in time because I got to give them something to smile about inside. And with my brother, big brother, Ahmad Bilal, when he did his time and he came out, every day when I would see him, I made sure he had a laugh because when we would leave each other's company, I knew that he was fighting this battle, this probation culture, if you will. And he was a proud man. He never broke the law. I remember one time he had a offer for a good job. What was it, brothers and sisters? Being a security guard at a medicinal marijuana spot. And I remember him saying, and I'll leave on this. I remember him saying, "Preach, I need this money." He said, "But I want to make my Lord mad." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm not going to take this job." He said, "I know God would be mad at me with this marijuana." And I said, "What are you going to go to?" He said, "I don't have anything to go to." He said, "I can only go to Allah." And at that point, you know, you want to help your brother, you love your brother, but it's clear the system, the system has broken something inside of him, as it's done with so many people, uh, blacks, Latinos, whites, women. The system has broken something inside of them purposely. Now, as we get the right, if you will, I'm going to ask everybody, if you see somebody um, coming out of jail and they have some problems or you think you can help, don't hesitate. Help them. You know why? Because the system is not trying to help them. Employ them. They want to work. Give them a meaningful wage. Do that because the opposite is the streets. The streets have no good in them. The streets is a probation culture just waiting to happen. So support these brothers and sisters. And while they're down, support their families, if you will. I'm not saying financially or whatever. If you can do that, that's wonderful. But call them. Let them know that, you know what, when this person comes home, we have to have a system in place where the probation culture, if you will, does not take them under. My name's Preacher Moss. God bless you. Remember, we have a great show tomorrow with the amazing Imam Zaid Shocker. You know Imam Zaid Shocker. He is one of the founders of Tuna College, the Lighthouse. I mean, if I kept going through everything this man has done for the community, we'd be back here another time. But listen, I thank you for your time and I thank you for your patience in going through something that's really, really personal to me. And I don't think it's being discussed enough, but I appreciate you giving me your ear and, you know, much gratitude. Preacher Moss, SOS. Take care now.